The room smelled of old blood and paraffin oil. November light, thin and grey, pressed against the single window of Miller's Court, but it would not enter. The door hung slightly ajar, its lock broken from the inside. A kettle sat cold upon the grate. The bed, narrow and iron-framed, bore the weight of what had been done in the darkest hours of the night. And across the threshold, in that East End rookery where 10,000 souls pressed against hunger and cold, the last victim of the Whitechapel murderer lay in pieces beneath a threadbare sheet. Her name had been Mary Jane Kelly. She had been 25 years old. She had sung the night before, a voice carrying through the thin walls of the court, some song from Ireland or Wales, the notes rising and falling like a child's memory of home, and then silence. A silence that lasted until Friday morning, when the rent collector knocked and received no answer, and peered through the broken window and saw what no man should see in this life or any other. The year was 1888. Victoria had ruled for 51 years. London's empire stretched across continents, its ships commanded every sea. But here, in the narrow passages of Spitalfields, in the sagging tenements of Dorset Street, the empire's lights did not reach. Here, women sold themselves for fourpence. Here, the fog rolled thick and yellow through gaslit alleys. And here, for 13 weeks, someone had been killing them, cutting them open beneath the November stars, leaving their bodies as terrible messages in the dawn. This was the 9th of November, the night of the Lord Mayor's show, and Mary Kelly would be the last. Chapter 1. The Court of Sorrows. Good evening, and welcome to the Bedside Historian. The night has settled around you now, wherever you find yourself in this vast world. Perhaps you're listening in the quiet hours before sleep, or in those small moments when the day has finally released its hold. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? What time shows on your clock as these words reach you across the distance? Before we begin our descent into the past, I ask a small favour of those who have joined us here. If this channel has become a companion to your evenings, if these stories from history's darker corridors have found a place in your nights, please consider subscribing. It is a simple gesture, but it helps this work continue, helps us preserve these forgotten moments, these voices that would otherwise fade completely into silence. And if you find value in tonight's tale, if it moves you or teaches you or simply helps you drift towards sleep, leave your thoughts below. Share this with someone who understands why we look backward into shadow. Every small act of support allows the Bedside Historian to grow, to reach more listeners, to keep these stories alive. Now then, let us dim the lights of the present. Let us step back through the fog of years to a London that no longer exists. A London of gas and coal smoke, of empire and destitution, of broad avenues that gave way to passages so narrow two people could not walk abreast. The year is 1888. Victoria has ruled for half a century. The British Empire spans the globe. But here, in the East End, in the district called Spitalfields, the Empire's wealth has never arrived. Here, a different world persists, medieval in its density, desperate in its poverty, and in the autumn of this year, stalked by something that turns that desperation into terror. Let us begin in a place called Miller's Court. It was not truly a court in any formal sense. There was no fountain, no statue, no remnant of civic planning. Miller's Court was simply a name given to a passageway, a narrow channel that ran between two buildings on Dorset Street, barely wide enough for a handcart, opening into a small courtyard surrounded by 6 decrepit dwellings. The passage entrance sat at number 26 Dorset Street, and if one walked through that dark tunnel-like opening, one emerged into a space no more than 15 feet across, where 6 doors faced inward like the cells of some forgotten monastery. The rooms were tiny, most measured 12 feet by 10 or smaller. They had been carved from larger structures, subdivided and subdivided again as landlords sought to extract maximum rent from minimum space. Each room housed a life, or several lives. or the flickering remnants of lives that had lost their shape. Some tenants stayed for years, others came and went like ghosts, appearing for a week or a month before disappearing back into London's anonymous vastness. Number 13 Miller's Court sat at the far end in the corner. It had a single window facing the court and a door that opened inward. The room measured perhaps 12 feet in length and 10 in width. Inside stood an iron bedstead, a small table, 2 chairs, and a fireplace with a broken grate. There was a single window, 2 panes of glass set in a wooden frame, and one of those panes had been broken some time ago and never repaired. The missing glass had been stuffed with rags to keep out the wind. This room could be rented for 4 shillings per week. The landlord was a man named John McCarthy, who kept a chandler's shop at the corner of Dorset Street and collected rents on Fridays. 4 shillings was not much, roughly equivalent to what a working man might earn in a day of hard labour. But for those who lived in Miller's Court, 4 shillings was often an impossible sum. Most of the residents were women who sold their bodies in the streets of Spitalfields. Some were widows. Some had been abandoned. Some had fled violence or shame from other parts of London or from the countryside beyond. All had found their way to this place because it was cheap, and because it asked no questions, and because in the vast machinery of Victorian London there were no other places left for them to go. Mary Jane Kelly had taken number 13 sometime in the spring of 1888. She had come with a man, Joseph Barnett, a fish porter from Billingsgate Market, who worked when work was available and loved her in his inarticulate way. They had lived together through the summer months, Joseph paying the rent when he could, Mary contributing what she earned through whatever means presented themselves. But by autumn, something had fractured. Joseph had moved out at the end of October. Mary remained, now alone, now responsible for the full 4 shillings each week, now returned to the life she had known before Joseph, the life of the streets, the doorways, the men who paid in coins. The court itself held a particular quality of shadow. Dorset Street, which ran parallel to Commercial Street and connected to the broader thoroughfares of Spitalfields, was known throughout London as one of the worst streets in the city. It had been called the worst street in London by those who documented poverty, and this was not hyperbole. The street measured only a few hundred feet in length, but it contained within that short span more lodging houses, more doss houses, more spaces where human beings were stacked like cargo than perhaps any other street in the Empire's capital. The architecture of Dorset Street reflected its purpose. The buildings rose 3 or 4 stories, their facades darkened by coal smoke and age. Ground floors held shops, a chandler's, a grocer's, a public house called the Britannia. Above these, rooms were let by the night or by the week to whoever could pay. And behind the street facades in spaces like Miller's Court were the subdivided warrens where those who could not afford even the 4pence for a common lodging-house bed could rent something that resembled privacy. The population of this single street was enormous. Estimates suggested that more than 1,000 people lived along Dorset Street and its associated courts and passages. They worked as labourers, costermongers, hawkers, prostitutes, thieves. They drank in the pubs that lined the street. They slept in shifts, sharing beds, sharing rooms, sharing the same stale air that never quite cleared. Disease moved through these spaces like an invisible river. Typhus, tuberculosis, smallpox, cholera. Children died with regularity. The old simply vanished, buried in unmarked graves at the parish's expense. Into this world, Mary Kelly had descended. She was different from many of her neighbours in one respect. She was young, only 25 years old, and she was considered attractive by the standards of the time and place. She had fair skin, blonde hair, and blue eyes. She stood about 5 feet 7 inches tall, which was above average for a woman of her class and era. She spoke with an accent that suggested origins in Ireland or Wales, though the details of her past were fragmentary, assembled from what she had told Joseph Barnett and a few others over drinks or in moments of confidence. She had told Joseph that she had been born in Limerick, Or perhaps in Wales? The story changed slightly in the telling. She had said that she'd been married once to a collier named Davies, and that he had died in a mining accident. She had said that she had gone to Cardiff and then to London, and that she had worked in a fashionable house in the West End serving wealthy clients who paid well. She had said that she'd even travelled to France once, to Paris, though whether this was true or a story she told to make her life seem larger than it was, no one could say with certainty. What was certain was that by 1888, whatever life she'd known before had narrowed to this: a room in Miller's Court, a rent she could not always pay, and the necessity of walking the streets after dark, approaching men, negotiating the transaction that would give her enough coins for another night's shelter, another measure of gin to dull the cold and fear. The court itself was never silent. Sounds carried through the thin walls, conversations, arguments, the intimate sounds of bodies in crowded spaces, the crying of children, the coughing of the sick. At night, footsteps echoed in the passage. Women returned from their work in the streets. Men came and went. Doors opened and closed. And in the autumn of 1888, beneath all these ordinary sounds of poverty, there moved a deeper current of dread. Because by November, everyone in Whitechapel knew about the murders. Everyone had heard the names: Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes. 4 women, all prostitutes, all killed in the streets or courts of Spitalfields and its surrounding districts, all found with their throats cut and their bodies opened in ways that suggested something beyond ordinary violence. The murders had begun in August and continued through September and into October. The newspapers called the killer Leather Apron at first, then Jack the Ripper, after a letter arrived at the Central News Agency, supposedly written by the murderer himself, signed with that theatrical name. The police walked the streets in greater numbers now. Vigilance committees had formed, local men who patrolled in groups watching for suspicious behaviour. Rewards were offered. Theories multiplied. The killer was a doctor, a butcher, a foreign sailor, a midwife, a madman escaped from an asylum, a member of the royal family, a Jewish slaughterman. The theories were endless and led nowhere, and still the women of Whitechapel went out into the night, because hunger and rent were more immediate than fear, and because survival required taking risks that those born to better circumstances could not imagine. Mary Kelly knew this mathematics. She had known it for years. And so, as November arrived and the nights grew colder, she continued her work. She walked Dorset Street and Commercial Street and the passages between. She stood in doorways, she approached men. She brought them back to number 13 Miller's Court, to that small room with its broken window and its iron bed, and she did what was necessary to earn the coins that would keep her from the workhouse or the gutter. The room itself bore witness to these transactions. The bed where she slept and worked, the table where she sometimes ate when there was food, the fireplace where she burned whatever she could find, wood, paper, clothing, to keep warm, the window through which thin daylight entered, and through which, on the morning of November the 9th, someone would look and see what had been done in darkness. But that morning had not yet come. In early November, Mary Kelly still lived. She still sang sometimes, her voice carrying through the court, old songs from Ireland, or popular melodies from the music halls. She still laughed with her neighbours. She still argued with her landlord about the rent she owed, which had accumulated to 29 shillings, more than 7 weeks' worth. She still drank with men in the public houses of Dorset Street. She still hoped, perhaps, that something might change, that Joseph might return, that some opportunity might present itself, that life might become something other than this narrow circuit of room and street and survival. And in the darkness of London, somewhere among the 500,000 souls who crowded into the East End's courts and tenements, someone watched these women. Someone selected them. Someone followed them into shadows and passages and private rooms. Someone cut their throats so deeply that the blades scraped vertebrae. Someone opened their bodies with a knife and took certain organs and arranged what remained in patterns that suggested not frenzy but terrible, methodical purpose. The autumn deepened. The fog rolled in from the Thames each evening, turning the streets into a landscape of shadows and gaslight. And in Miller's Court, Mary Kelly lived her last days, unaware that she would become the final victim, the one whose death would exceed all others in its savagery, the one whose murder would close the Ripper's account and leave London with a mystery that would never be solved. The court waited. The city waited. And history, with its patient and terrible rhythm, moved toward the morning of November 9th. Chapter 2. The Woman Who Sang. Mary Jane Kelly had not always lived in Miller's Court. She had not always walked the streets of Spitalfields. There had been other places, other lives, though the details grew hazy in the telling, filtered through gin and time and the necessary forgetting that poverty required. What remained were fragments, stories she had told to Joseph Barnett during their months together, memories she had shared with neighbours over drinks, pieces of a past that may have been true or may have been the stories one tells to make sense of a life that had lost its shape. She had been born, she said, in Limerick. The year was uncertain, perhaps 1863, which would make her 25 in the autumn of 1888. Ireland in the 1860s was still recovering from the Great Hunger, that catastrophe of famine and disease that had killed 1 million people and sent another million fleeing across oceans. Those who remained lived in conditions that the British Parliament occasionally investigated and rarely improved. The land was divided into estates controlled by absentee English landlords. The Catholic majority worked as tenant farmers or labourers, paying rent that consumed most of what they grew or earned. Evictions were common. Starvation remained a possibility in bad years, and for young women without land or prospects, the choices were limited: marriage, domestic service, emigration, or the convent. Mary had chosen none of these paths, or perhaps they had not been offered to her. Instead, at some point in her childhood or youth, she had left Ireland. She had told Joseph that her family had moved to Wales, to Carmarthenshire, when she was young. She had said that her father had worked in an ironworks there, that she had grown up in a town where Welsh was spoken as often as English, where chapel going and coal dust defined the rhythm of life. But these details shifted in the telling. Sometimes she said she had been born in Wales. Sometimes she said Limerick. The truth, whatever it was, had become less important than survival in the present. What seemed more certain was that she had married young. She had told Joseph about a husband named Davies, a collier who had worked in the mines of South Wales. She had said that they had been married when she was 16, that they had been happy for a brief time, that he had died in a mine explosion or accident when she was still barely more than a girl. Whether this marriage had actually occurred, whether Davies had existed, whether any of these details were factual or merely the necessary mythology of a life that needed some justification, these questions could not be answered. Mary Jane Kelly left no documents, no marriage certificate, no record in parish registers. She existed in memory and in the statements of those who had known her briefly, and memory was always an unreliable witness. After the death of her husband, real or invented, Mary had made her way to London. This journey would have taken place in the early 1880s, when she was perhaps 18 or 19 years old. London in those years was the largest city on earth, home to more than 5 million people, the capital of an empire that governed a quarter of the world's population. It was a city of extraordinary contrasts, of grand boulevards and fetid slums, of opera houses and gin palaces, of wealth accumulated through global trade and poverty as absolute as any in human history. For a young woman arriving alone, London offered limited possibilities. Domestic service was the most common employment for women of the lower classes, working as a maid, a cook, a laundress in the households of the middle and upper classes. The work was hard, the hours long, the pay minimal, but it provided food and shelter and a measure of respectability. Some women found positions in factories or workshops, sewing garments or making matchboxes or processing food. Others worked as street sellers, hawking flowers or watercress or matches, and some, through circumstance or choice or the absence of any other option, entered prostitution, Mary had told Joseph that she had worked in a high-class establishment in the West End, that she'd served wealthy clients, that she had lived well for a time. She had even claimed to have travelled to France, to Paris, as the companion of a gentleman. These stories had the quality of romance about them. The poor Irish girl elevated briefly to a better world, mingling with wealth and sophistication before some reversal of fortune sent her tumbling back down. Whether any of this was true remained uncertain. What was certain was that by the mid-1880s, Mary Jane Kelly was working as a prostitute in the East End of London, far from whatever West End elegance she may or may not have known. She had lived for a time in a lodging house on Breezes Hill in Ratcliffe. This was another notorious street, similar to Dorset Street in its poverty and density. She had worked the streets of the docks, approaching sailors and labourers, negotiating transactions in doorways and alleys. At some point, she had moved to Spitalfields, perhaps because the competition was less fierce there, perhaps because the network of courts and passages offered more opportunities for private transactions, perhaps because she had simply drifted that direction as the tide of poverty moved her through London's geography. In April of 1887, she had met Joseph Barnett. He was a few years older than Mary, a man from the East End who had worked since childhood, first as a hawker and then as a fish porter at Billingsgate Market. He was not educated, not wealthy, not remarkable in any way except that he had fallen in love with Mary Kelly, and she had agreed to live with him. They had taken a room together in George Street first, then had moved to Miller's Court when that room became available. For more than a year they had lived as a couple, not married but committed in the way of the poor, sharing what little they had. Joseph had tried to keep Mary from the streets. When he had work, when he earned enough to pay the rent and buy food, Mary did not need to sell herself. But work at Billingsgate was irregular. Fish arrived when it arrived, and the porters were hired by the day or the load. Some weeks Joseph earned enough, other weeks he earned nothing. And when Joseph could not pay, Mary did what she had to do. This created tension between them, Joseph's love competing with his shame and helplessness, Mary's pragmatism competing with her desire for something better. They argued. They drank together in the pubs of Dorset Street. They reconciled, and then they argued again. In the summer of 1888, Mary had taken in another woman, a prostitute named Julia, who needed a place to sleep. Joseph had objected to this. He did not want another woman in their room, did not want Mary associating too closely with the life of the streets. The argument had escalated, and sometime in late October, Joseph had moved out. He had not gone far. He was still in the neighbourhood, still visited Mary, still gave her money when he had it. But they no longer lived together. Mary was alone now in number 13 Miller's Court, and the rent accumulated in her absence of payment. Those who knew Mary in these final months described her in consistent terms. She was considered attractive, with fair hair that she sometimes wore up and sometimes down, with blue or grey eyes depending on the light, with a figure that was fuller than many of the emaciated women who walk the streets. She was taller than average, which some men found appealing. She had a pleasant manner when she was sober, could be charming when she needed to be. But she drank heavily, as nearly everyone in Spitalfields drank heavily, because gin was cheap and numbed the cold and fear. When she drank, her mood could shift. She could become loud, argumentative, melancholy. She sang sometimes, her voice carrying through the thin walls of the court, songs from Ireland or Wales that spoke of home and loss. She had friends, or something like friends, in the court and on Dorset Street. There was Julia Venturney, who lived in number 1 Miller's Court with a man named Harry. There was Lizzie Albrook, who had known Mary for some time. There was Maria Harvey, another prostitute who sometimes stayed with Mary when she had nowhere else to go. These women looked out for each other in small ways, shared information about dangerous clients, lent each other coins or clothing, provided the minimal support network that sustained life at the edge of survival. Mary owed money beyond her rent. She owed money to local shopkeepers. She owed money to friends. The debts accumulated like the cold pressing in from all sides, and so she worked. She walked Commercial Street and Flower and Dean Street and the passages between. She stood in the doorways of public houses. She approached men in the gaslight. She negotiated prices, 4p for a basic transaction, more if the client wanted additional services or time. She brought men back to Miller's Court when the weather was too cold for outdoor work, climbing the narrow passage to her room, lighting the stub of a candle, conducting her business on the iron bed. The work was dangerous even in ordinary times. Men could be violent. They could refuse to pay. They could rob the women they hired. Disease was a constant risk. Syphilis, gonorrhea, infections that had no effective treatment. Pregnancy was another danger, though women knew methods to prevent it or end it. Knowledge passed between them like secret wisdom. The police occasionally harassed prostitutes, though generally they ignored the transactions unless someone complained. And always there was the risk of simply disappearing, of being found dead in an alley, of becoming one more anonymous casualty in a city that produced such casualties by the thousands. But the autumn of 1888 had added a new dimension to this danger. The murders that had begun in August had changed the calculation. The Whitechapel killer was targeting prostitutes specifically, following them into dark places, cutting their throats before they could scream, opening their bodies with a knife. 4 women were dead by November. Every prostitute in Spitalfields knew their names, knew how they had died, knew that any night's work might be the last. Yet they continued, because the alternative, the workhouse, starvation, sleeping rough in November cold, was also a form of death, merely slower. Mary Kelly knew the victims, not intimately perhaps, but in the way that people in small communities know each other by sight and reputation. Annie Chapman had worked the same streets. Elizabeth Stride had drunk in the same pubs. The murders were not distant events read about in newspapers. They were immediate, personal, terrifying in their proximity. And yet the terror competed with more urgent needs. Rent came due. Hunger returned daily. The body demanded warmth and food before it would respond to fear. In early November, Mary Kelly continued her routines. She drank at the Britannia pub at the corner of Dorset Street. She walked the streets in the evening. She brought men back to her room. She sang sometimes, her voice rising in the darkness of Miller's Court. She argued with her landlord about the rent she owed. She saw Joseph Barnett occasionally, accepted money from him, perhaps hoped that he might return fully, that they might resume the life they had tried to build before poverty and circumstance and the pressures of survival had forced them apart. She had no way of knowing that she would live only a few more days. No premonition visited her, no supernatural warning. She was simply a woman trying to survive in a city that offered limited mercy to those born without means. She was 25 years old. She had lived long enough to lose whatever innocence she'd begun with, long enough to understand that life would not improve, that this was what remained, Miller's Court and Dorset Street and the nightly calculation of risk and need. The woman who sang would soon be silent. But in early November she still lived, still hoped in whatever small ways were available to her, still moved through the routines that sustained existence at the edge of London's vast and indifferent machinery. History was moving toward her, but she could not see it coming. None of them could. The city continued its ordinary brutalities, and Mary Jane Kelly continued her ordinary survival until the night when ordinary brutality transformed into something that would be remembered for more than a century afterward. Chapter 3. The Autumn of Blood. The first body had been found on the last day of August. The woman's name was Mary Ann Nichols, though she was known as Polly to those who had known her in the lodging houses of Spitalfields. She was 43 years old. She had been married once, had borne 5 children, but drink and poverty had destroyed that life years earlier. By the summer of 1888, she was walking the streets, sleeping in common lodging houses when she had 4p for a bed, sleeping rough when she did not. On the night of August 30th, she had been turned away from a lodging house on Thrall Street because she lacked the money for a bed. She had told the deputy keeper not to let her bed to anyone else, that she would earn the fourpence and return. She'd been seen walking toward Whitechapel Road, slightly drunk, wearing a black straw bonnet and a brown dress. She had disappeared into the network of streets and passages that connected Spitalfields to Whitechapel, and at 3:30 in the morning a cart driver named Charles Cross had found her lying in Bucks Row, a narrow street lined with warehouses and tenements. She was dead. Her throat had been cut so deeply that the head was nearly severed from the body. The wound was wide and terrible, executed with such force that it had cut through to the vertebrae. But the killer had not stopped with the throat. When the police arrived and examined the body, they discovered that her abdomen had been cut open, that long incisions ran from the lower ribs to the pelvis, that the wounds suggested someone with knowledge of human anatomy, or at least comfort with cutting flesh. There was surprisingly little blood in the street, which suggested that the throat had been cut first, that death had come quickly, that the abdominal mutilations had been performed after the heart had stopped beating. The police had initially treated this as another tragic but not unusual murder. Women were killed in the East End with some frequency. Domestic violence, robbery, drunken fights, these produced bodies regularly. But something about Polly Nichols' wounds troubled the examining physician. The cuts were too precise, too deliberate. The killer had taken time with the body, even in a public street where discovery was always possible. This suggested either madness or terrible self-control, and the distinction between the two was not always clear. 8 days later, on the morning of September 8th, another body was discovered. The woman's name was Annie Chapman, known as Dark Annie because of her complexion. She was 47 years old, another veteran of the streets and lodging houses. She'd been ill recently, suffering from some respiratory ailment, but illness did not excuse her from the necessity of earning money. On the night of September 7th, she'd been seen talking to a man near the corner of Hanbury Street at about 5:30 in the morning. 30 minutes later, she was found dead in the backyard of number 29 Hanbury Street, a narrow passage between buildings where the killer had taken her or where she had taken him. Her throat was cut in the same manner as Polly Nichols, a deep, violent wound that severed through to the spine, but the abdominal mutilations were more extensive. Her intestines had been pulled out and placed over her shoulder, her uterus and parts of her bladder had been removed and taken away. The killer had arranged her few possessions, some coins, 2 combs, a piece of envelope, near her feet in a careful pattern. The murder had taken place in a narrow yard surrounded by buildings full of people in the growing light of dawn. Yet no one had heard her scream. No one had seen the killer enter or leave. The newspapers seized upon the story. The murders were no longer isolated tragedies, but a pattern, evidence of something unprecedented stalking the East End. The press began calling the killer Leather Apron, after rumours that he wore such a garment, though this identification was based on nothing more than speculation and prejudice against the Jewish population of Spitalfields. The police increased patrols, local residents formed vigilance committees, and the women of Whitechapel, who had no choice but to continue working, began to walk with greater fear. September passed in dread. The police investigated hundreds of leads that went nowhere. They questioned local butchers, doctors, anyone whose profession involved cutting flesh. They arrested a man named John Pizer, a Jewish bootmaker who had been identified as possibly being Leather Apron, but they released him when he provided alibis for the murder nights. Theories multiplied. The killer was a doctor gone mad. The killer was a foreign sailor. The killer was a ritual slaughterman from one of the Jewish communities. The theories were endless and led nowhere. On September 27th, a letter arrived at the Central News Agency in London. It was written in red ink, or possibly blood. The analysis was inconclusive. The letter was addressed "Dear Boss" and claimed to be from the killer. It mocked the police. It promised more murders. And it was signed Jack the Ripper. Whether the letter was genuinely from the killer or from a journalist seeking to sensationalize the story was never determined, but the name stuck. The Whitechapel murderer became Jack the Ripper in the public imagination, and that theatrical name transformed the murders from local tragedy into national obsession. The night of September 30th brought horror doubled. 2 women were killed within an hour of each other, in locations less than a mile apart. The first victim was Elizabeth Stride, a Swedish immigrant who had lived in London for more than 20 years. She was 44 years old, another prostitute working the streets of Spitalfields. At 1 o'clock in the morning, she was found in Dutfield's yard, a narrow courtyard off Burner Street. Her throat had been cut, a wound similar to the previous victims, but there were no abdominal mutilations. The theory emerged that the killer had been interrupted, that someone had entered the yard, that the killer had fled before he could complete his work. The second victim was Catherine Eddowes, 46 years old, found in Mitre Square in the City of London at 1:30 in the morning. Her throat was cut. Her face was mutilated, cuts across her nose and cheeks. Her abdomen was opened extensively. Her left kidney and her uterus had been removed and taken away. The murder had occurred in the City of London rather than in Whitechapel, which meant it fell under the jurisdiction of the City of London Police rather than the Metropolitan Police. This jurisdictional division would complicate the investigation, as the 2 police forces had different procedures and did not always cooperate effectively. 2 murders in one night, 2 women killed within the span of an hour. The pattern was escalating. And the next day, a postcard arrived at the Central News Agency, supposedly from the killer, claiming credit for the double murder. The postcard used the name Jack the Ripper. It referred to the 2 victims. It mocked the police's inability to catch him. Whether genuine or hoax, it fueled the public's fascination and terror. October passed without another murder. The police presence in Whitechapel was overwhelming now. Hundreds of officers walked the streets. Detectives investigated every suspicious person, every unusual behaviour. Bloodhounds were brought in, though they proved useless. Rewards were offered, money from the government, from newspapers, from local businessmen who feared the murders were damaging trade. Yet no credible suspect emerged. The killer, whoever he was, had vanished into London's vast population as thoroughly as if he had never existed. The women of Spitalfields continued their work because they had no choice. Hunger and rent did not pause for fear, but the streets were quieter now. Women walked in pairs when possible. They avoided the darkest passages. They carried knives or stones for protection. And they told each other stories about near misses, about suspicious men they had encountered, about the ways they stayed safe. These stories became a kind of collective knowledge, a shared map of danger that was passed between them like a currency more valuable than coins. Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes. 4 names. 4 women whose lives had been hard and whose deaths had been terrible. They were buried in paupers' graves, their funerals attended by crowds of curious onlookers who came to gawk at tragedy. The newspapers printed their life stories, or versions of their life stories, emphasizing their poverty and degradation in ways that suggested they had somehow contributed to their own murders. Respectability was measured against them and found them lacking. Yet they had been women with histories, with children they had borne, with lives that had narrowed over years of poverty and circumstance, until those lives ended in a moment of violence so extreme it seemed to exceed human capacity. The police investigation produced volumes of statements and reports and theories, but no arrest. The suspect list grew to hundreds of names, each investigated and eliminated. The detectives assigned to the case worked exhaustively, but they were operating in a neighbourhood where poverty made everyone a potential witness, and no one wanted to speak to police, where the darkness and the maze-like streets provided countless escape routes, where the killer could be anyone, a local resident, a visitor from another part of London, someone who simply vanished back into ordinary life after committing extraordinary violence. By early November, it had been a month since the last murder. Some began to hope that the killings had ended, that the Ripper had died or been arrested for some other crime or simply stopped. But those who knew the streets of Spitalfields, who understood the logic of predation, recognised that a month was not long enough to declare safety. The killer might simply be waiting. He might be watching. He might be selecting his next victim with the care that the previous murders suggested. Someone vulnerable, someone who would take him to a private place, someone whose death he could conduct with the methodical attention that seemed to characterise his work. The autumn deepened. November brought colder nights, fog that rolled through the streets each evening, turning the gaslight into diffuse halos of yellow. The women of Whitechapel wrapped themselves in whatever clothing they had and continued their nightly routines. And somewhere among them, unseen and unsuspected, the Whitechapel murderer prepared for his final performance, the killing that would exceed all others in its savagery and become the signature by which he would be remembered across more than a century of speculation and horror. Chapter 4. The Vigil of the East. The Metropolitan Police Force that patrolled Whitechapel in the autumn of 1888 was a relatively young institution. Organised policing had existed in London for less than 60 years. Before that, the city had relied on a patchwork of night watchmen, parish constables and private security that was ineffective against serious crime. The Metropolitan Police had been established in 1829, its officers recognisable by their distinctive uniforms. Dark blue coats, tall helmets, the badge of authority that was still new enough to inspire both respect and suspicion among the working classes. The force was organised into divisions, each responsible for a geographic area of London. H Division covered Whitechapel, and its headquarters were located on Commercial Street, within walking distance of all the murder sites. The division was commanded by a superintendent with inspectors and sergeants overseeing the constables who walked the beats. These constables were working men themselves, drawn from the same social class as those they policed, paid about £1 per week for work that was dangerous and often thankless. They walked fixed routes, following a schedule that had them passing certain points at predictable intervals. This regularity made them visible, which was intended to deter crime, but it also made them predictable, which meant anyone watching could know exactly when a constable would be present or absent from a particular street. By November, H Division had been reinforced. Extra constables had been assigned to Whitechapel. Plainclothes detectives walked the streets pretending to be ordinary residents. The detective force, which operated separately from the uniformed police, had assigned some of its best investigators to the Ripper case. These men interviewed witnesses, followed leads, compiled reports that grew thicker by the week. But the sheer volume of information was overwhelming. Hundreds of people claimed to have seen suspicious men. Dozens of individuals were reported as possible suspects. Every lead had to be investigated, every tip followed, and nearly all of them led nowhere. The detective in charge of the investigation was Inspector Frederick Aberline, a career policeman who had worked in Whitechapel for many years before being transferred to Scotland Yard. He knew the neighbourhood intimately, its streets and passages, its pubs and lodging houses, the complex social networks that governed life in the East End. He was methodical, thorough, patient in his work. But he was also operating without the tools that would later become standard in criminal investigation. There was no fingerprint analysis. There was no forensic science beyond basic post-mortem examination. Witness testimony was unreliable, especially in a neighbourhood where people distrusted police and where poverty made everyone desperate enough to say whatever might earn a reward. The investigation proceeded through traditional methods: interviewing, observing, waiting for the killer to make a mistake. The police faced other challenges beyond their limited investigative tools. The murders had occurred in a neighbourhood that was itself a kind of maze. Whitechapel and Spitalfields were crowded with courts and passages, narrow alleys that twisted between buildings, dead ends and hidden yards where a person could disappear in seconds. The buildings were old, many dating from the 17th or 18th century, structures that had been subdivided and modified over generations until their interiors were labyrinths. A killer familiar with this geography could move through it invisibly, entering and leaving murder sites without being seen, using the darkness and architectural complexity as natural camouflage. The population itself was transient. Thousands of people moved through Whitechapel constantly. Sailors from the docks, labourers seeking work, prostitutes and criminals and migrants who stayed for a few nights in a lodging house before moving on. Many gave false names. Many had no fixed address. The lodging houses kept minimal records, and those records were often invented. The police could question 100 people and discover that half of them had provided false information, not because they were involved in the murders, but simply because providing false information to authority was a survival strategy in a world where documentation could be used against you. The press complicated the investigation. Every newspaper in London covered the murders extensively, and many printed lurid details that were partially or completely fabricated. Reporters interviewed witnesses before the police could reach them, potentially contaminating testimony. The newspapers printed theories about the killer's identity that had no basis in evidence, but which the public accepted as fact. The letters supposedly from Jack the Ripper, which may have been written by journalists seeking to boost circulation, created expectations that the killer was theatrical and taunting, when in reality he might be entirely ordinary in appearance and behaviour. The press coverage created pressure on the police to make an arrest, any arrest, and this pressure led to mistakes. Innocent men detained, questioned aggressively, released only after alibis were confirmed. The public response to the murders was complex. In the West End, among the middle and upper classes, there was fascination mixed with moral judgment. The murders were terrible, but they were also happening far away, in neighbourhoods that respectable people never visited, to women whose profession placed them outside the bounds of sympathy. Editorial writers used the murders to argue for social reform, for the closing of lodging houses, for increased policing of vice. But these arguments rarely translated into actual support for the women who lived in Whitechapel. The murders revealed the poverty of the East End to those who had not known or cared about it before, but revelation did not produce change. In Whitechapel itself, the response was different. The murders were not distant tragedy, but immediate threat. Everyone knew someone who had known one of the victims. The geography of fear was precise. This street where Annie Chapman had been killed. That yard where Elizabeth Stride had died. Women altered their routines, avoided certain passages, tried to work in pairs. But economics limited their options. Rent came due. Food had to be purchased. The body required warmth. And so the work continued, though the fear was palpable. Vigilance committees formed throughout the East End. These were groups of local men who organised patrols, walking the streets in groups, watching for suspicious behaviour. The Whitechapel Vigilance Committee was the largest and most organised, led by a local builder named George Lusk. They printed handbills requesting information. They offered rewards from funds they collected among local businessmen. They pressured the police and the Home Office to do more. In mid-October, George Lusk received a package at his home. Inside was half of a human kidney, preserved in wine. A letter accompanied it, supposedly from Jack the Ripper, claiming that the kidney belonged to Catherine Eddowes and that the killer had fried and eaten the other half. Medical examination could not definitively prove the kidney's origin, and whether the package was from the actual killer or from someone with access to anatomical specimens remained uncertain. But it demonstrated the level of public engagement with the murders. People were not merely afraid, but fascinated, drawn to the horror in ways that exceeded ordinary concern. The Home Office, which oversaw policing, faced political pressure to solve the murders. The Home Secretary received letters from members of Parliament, from civic organisations, from ordinary citizens demanding action. The government offered a reward. though this was unusual policy and created its own problems by encouraging false accusations and useless tips. The Queen herself was said to have expressed concern, though royal involvement in criminal investigations was largely symbolic. By early November, the investigation had reached a kind of impasse. Hundreds of statements had been taken. Dozens of suspects had been investigated and eliminated. The police had no physical evidence that pointed to any specific individual. They had no reliable witnesses who could identify the killer. They had only the bodies and the wounds those bodies bore, and from these they could infer certain things: that the killer was likely male, that he possessed some degree of anatomical knowledge or at least comfort with cutting flesh, that he was strong enough to overpower women quickly and silent enough to kill without raising alarm, that he lived in or had access to the neighbourhood, that he could pass as ordinary enough that women would agree to go with him into dark places. The detectives theorised that the killer might be a butcher, familiar with animal slaughter, or a doctor, though this seemed unlikely given that doctors were too visible and too accountable, or a midwife, though the gender seemed wrong, or simply a madman, though the precision of the wound suggested something other than frenzy. The theories circled and multiplied and led nowhere, and while the police theorised, the women of Whitechapel continued their nightly work, because theory did not pay rent and speculation did not purchase food. The streets themselves seemed to wait. Commercial Street with its shops and pubs, Dorset Street with its lodging houses, Flower and Dean Street, Fashion Street, Thrall Street, all the narrow passages where poverty concentrated and life was reduced to its most basic calculations. The gas lamps created islands of light in the darkness, but between the lamps the shadows were absolute. A person could stand 10 feet from a constable and be invisible. A person could commit murder in a yard or passage and disappear before anyone responded to a cry that might not even be heard through the noise of daily life. The police walked their beats with greater vigilance now, but vigilance had its limits. A constable could not be everywhere. The force was stretched thin even with reinforcements, and the Whitechapel killer, whoever he was, had demonstrated patience and selection. He did not kill randomly. He chose his victims carefully, waited for the right circumstances, executed his work with speed and efficiency. This suggested not the wild attacks of a madman, but the calculated predation of someone who understood risk and opportunity, someone who planned and prepared and struck when conditions were favourable. November brought shorter days and longer nights. The fog settled over the city each evening, thick and yellow with coal smoke, reducing visibility to a few feet. This was the London fog that would become legendary, but for those walking the streets of Whitechapel, it was simply another layer of danger, another element of the environment that favoured predators over prey. And somewhere in that fog, moving through those streets, the Whitechapel murderer prepared for his final act, the murder that would be so extreme in its violence that it would become the defining image of his work, the case that would obsess investigators for more than a century, the death of a woman who would become more famous in dying than she had ever been in life. Chapter 5. The Lord Mayor's Night. The 8th of November 1888 was a Thursday. In the City of London, the financial and administrative heart of the Empire's capital, preparations were underway for one of the year's grandest ceremonies. The Lord Mayor's show would take place the following day, a procession that dated back to the 13th century, when the newly elected Lord Mayor of London was required to travel to Westminster to swear loyalty to the Crown. Over the centuries, this journey had become an elaborate pageant, with gilded coaches, marching bands, costume performers, and thousands of spectators lining the route from the Guildhall to the Royal Courts of Justice. The Lord Mayor's show was a display of civic pride and imperial power. It demonstrated London's wealth, its history, its position at the centre of global commerce. The newspapers would cover it extensively. The middle and upper classes would attend or read about it with satisfaction. But in Whitechapel, 3 miles to the east, the Lord Mayor's show was irrelevant. The pageantry of empire did not reach these streets. The wealth on display in the procession had been extracted, in part from the labour of people who would never see the gilded coaches or the ceremonial robes, who would spend November 9th working or sleeping or drinking or simply surviving as they spent every other day. Mary Jane Kelly woke on Thursday morning in her room at number 13 Miller's Court. The exact hour of her waking was not recorded. She had no employment that required regular hours, no appointments that demanded punctuality. Her day would unfold according to the rhythms of necessity: hunger, thirst, the need for warmth, the eventual need to earn money for rent and food. These were the structures that organised her time, not clocks or schedules or the demands of respectable labour. The room was cold. November in London brought temperatures that hovered near freezing, and the small fireplace in her room provided minimal heat even when she had fuel to burn. She dressed in the clothing she owned: a linsey frock, dark in colour, a knit crossover shawl, a red knitted petticoat, boots that were worn but serviceable. She had a black jacket as well, though whether she wore it that day or it hung on a chair was not documented. Her possessions were few. The room contained the bed, the table, the chairs, a few items of clothing, some broken crockery. There was nothing of value, nothing that could be pawned for more than a few pence. She left the court at some point during the day. Several people saw her on Dorset Street or in the surrounding area. She was recognised because she was known in the neighbourhood, because her height and her fair hair made her distinctive, because those who lived in these streets developed a detailed knowledge of their neighbours, born from proximity and shared circumstance. She went to a pub, possibly the Britannia at the corner of Dorset Street. She may have eaten something, though what and where was not recorded. She may have visited the chandler's shop, though she had no money to purchase anything. The details of her Thursday afternoon dissolved into the ordinary obscurity of a day that no one had reason to document. What was documented was that Mary owed rent. John McCarthy, her landlord, had been patient, but patience had limits. She was behind by 29 shillings, more than 7 weeks of rent. This was a substantial debt in a neighbourhood where most transactions were measured in pence. McCarthy wanted his money, and Mary had been avoiding him, or promising payment, or explaining that she would have the money soon. All the strategies that the poor deployed when debts accumulated beyond their ability to pay. Thursday evening arrived. The darkness came early in November, the sun setting before 5 o'clock, the twilight brief before full night settled over the city. The gas lamps were lit along the main streets, Commercial Street, Whitechapel Road, but the courts and passages remained darker, illuminated only by whatever light spilled from windows or by the occasional lamp someone carried. Mary remained in or near Miller's Court. She was seen by neighbours. She spoke to a few people, though the content of those conversations was not preserved. And as the night deepened, she began the work that necessity demanded. At some point in the evening, Mary left Miller's Court and walked to the Britannia pub. This was her local, the public house, where she and Joseph Barnett had drunk together during their time as a couple, where she still went when she had money or when someone would buy her drinks. The pub would have been crowded on a Thursday night, working men spending their wages, prostitutes looking for clients, the usual population of the East End's drinking establishments. The air inside would have been thick with tobacco smoke and the smell of beer and unwashed bodies pressed together. Conversation would have been loud, competing with itself, creating a wall of sound that was both companionship and anonymity. Mary drank. Whether she paid for her own drinks or whether someone bought them for her was not recorded. She may have been looking for clients, assessing the men in the pub for their potential as customers, or she may have simply been drinking to numb the cold and the fear and the grinding awareness of the rent she owed and the winter that was coming. Gin was cheap and effective. It warmed from the inside. It softened the edges of existence. And in the autumn of 1888, with 4 women already murdered and the Ripper still uncaught, there were many edges that needed softening. Sometime before midnight, Mary was seen leaving the Britannia. She was walking toward Dorset Street, toward Miller's Court. She was not alone. A man was with her, though descriptions of this man varied among those who claimed to have seen him. One witness said he was about 35 years old, well dressed by the standards of Spitalfields, wearing a dark coat and a moustache. Another witness described someone shorter, younger, wearing different clothing. The descriptions did not align well enough to create a clear picture, but the presence of a man was consistent across multiple accounts. Mary was bringing someone back to her room. This was standard practice. Prostitutes brought clients to their rooms when possible, especially in cold weather, especially when the transaction required more time or privacy than a doorway or alley could provide. Mary had done this countless times before. She knew the risks, but she also knew that the alternative, refusing all clients, earning no money, was not sustainable. And so she walked back through the darkness of Dorset Street, entered the narrow passage that led to Miller's Court, and approached her door at number 13 with a man following behind her. The time was approaching midnight. In other parts of London, the preparations for the Lord Mayor's show continued. Banners were hung, costumes were prepared, the route was secured, the newspapers had printed their preview articles. The city's attention would turn tomorrow to pageantry and celebration. But in Miller's Court, a different ritual was about to unfold, one that would not be witnessed or recorded until the morning light revealed its aftermath. Mary entered her room. The man entered behind her. The door closed. The court fell silent, or as silent as it ever became, the usual sounds of poverty continuing through the thin walls, people talking, arguing, coughing, the sounds of survival in crowded spaces. No one heard anything unusual. No one heard a scream. The murder that was about to occur would be conducted in near-perfect silence, which suggested either that Mary had been killed so quickly she could not cry out, or that she had been subdued in some way that prevented sound, or that the walls of Miller's Court had absorbed whatever noise was made. The night progressed, midnight passed, the pubs closed at their appointed hours, releasing crowds of drunk and exhausted people back into the streets. Constables walked their beats, passing through Dorset Street at their scheduled intervals, seeing nothing unusual. The residents of Miller's Court slept or tried to sleep, their lives continuing in parallel to whatever was happening in number 13. And inside that room, in the darkness illuminated only by the stub of a candle, or perhaps by the fireplace where something was burning, the Whitechapel murderer performed his final work. The details of what occurred would not be known until morning, but the evidence that would be discovered suggested that the killer had taken his time. Unlike the previous murders, which had occurred in public or semi-public spaces where discovery was always imminent, this murder took place in a private room with a door that could be locked from the inside. The killer had privacy. He had time. He had light enough to see what he was doing, and he used these advantages to conduct a mutilation so extensive that it would exceed all the previous murders in its savagery. Mary Jane Kelly sang sometimes. Her neighbours had heard her voice through the walls on many nights, songs from Ireland or Wales, melodies that spoke of places she'd left behind, or perhaps had never truly known. Whether she sang on this night, whether her last sounds were song or screams or silence, no one could say with certainty. One witness would later claim to have heard a cry of murder, sometime around 4 a.m, but this testimony was vague and contradictory. Murder was not an uncommon cry in Whitechapel. People shouted it during fights, during robberies, sometimes as a joke. The word had lost its urgency through overuse. And so if Mary did cry out, if she did call for help in her final moments, no one responded. No one came. The night continued around her dying. The killer worked methodically. The wounds he inflicted suggested not frenzy but terrible focus, a systematic approach to destroying a human body. He cut her throat, the wound extending from ear to ear, severing through to the spine. He opened her abdomen. He removed organs. He mutilated her face beyond recognition. He arranged pieces of her flesh around the room in patterns that suggested ritual or simply the complete absence of restraint that privacy allowed. And when he was finished, when he had done everything that his compulsion, or madness or hatred demanded, he left. He opened the door, stepped out into Miller's Court, closed the door behind him, and disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness of November 9th. No one saw him leave. No witness came forward to say they had seen a man exiting number 13 with blood on his hands or clothing. The killer either cleaned himself in the room before leaving, or he left in darkness deep enough that blood would not be visible, or he simply walked away unnoticed because a man walking through Dorset Street at 4 or 5 in the morning was not unusual enough to warrant attention. The architecture of poverty protected him. The indifference of exhaustion protected him. And by the time the sun rose over London, by the time the Lord Mayor's procession began to form, by the time the first person knocked on Mary Kelly's door and received no answer, the Whitechapel murderer had vanished as completely as if he had never existed. Chapter 6. The Hours of Darkness. The night deepened over Miller's Court. The sounds of Thursday evening gradually diminished as the residents of Dorset Street and its associated courts settled into whatever rest poverty allowed. The pubs had closed. The street traffic had thinned. A few late workers made their way home. A few prostitutes still walked the streets, too desperate or too drunk to stop. But mostly, the neighbourhood had fallen into the uneasy quiet that preceded dawn, that hour when the city held its breath before resuming its daily struggle. Inside number 13 Miller's Court, Mary Jane Kelly lay dead upon her bed. The room that had sheltered her for the past 7 months had become the site of her destruction. What had been done to her exceeded anything the Whitechapel murderer had previously attempted. The privacy of the room, the locked door, the hours of darkness, these had given him license to work without the time pressure that had constrained his previous murders, and he had used that time to conduct a mutilation so complete that it would horrify even the physicians who examined murder victims regularly. The details would not be discovered until morning, but the evidence would tell a story of systematic violence. The killer had begun, as he had with all his victims, by cutting the throat. The wound was enormous, extending from ear to ear, cutting so deeply that it severed through the windpipe and the major blood vessels and scraped against the vertebrae of the neck. This wound would have caused death within moments, unconsciousness even faster. Blood would have poured from the wound, soaking the bed, spreading across the mattress in a dark pool that would still be wet when the body was discovered hours later. But the throat cutting was only the beginning. Once Mary was dead or dying, unable to resist or cry out, the killer had proceeded to open her body. He had made a long incision from the throat down through the abdomen, exposing the internal organs. He had removed the heart and placed it on the pillow beside her head. He had removed other organs, the kidneys, the liver, portions of the intestines, and had arranged them around the body in ways that suggested either deliberate placement or simply the careless distribution of parts he had extracted. The uterus was missing entirely, taken by the killer as he had taken organs from previous victims. The face had been mutilated beyond recognition. The nose had been cut away. The cheeks had been sliced off. The ears had been partially removed. The forehead and scalp had been cut and peeled back, exposing the skull beneath. The eyes had been damaged. The lips had been cut. What remained bore no resemblance to the woman who had sung through the walls of Miller's Court, whose fair hair and blue eyes had made her distinctive among her neighbours. The destruction of the face seemed almost personal, as if the killer had wanted to erase not just Mary's life but her identity, to transform her from a person into an object, a collection of parts that no longer assembled into anything recognisable as human. The breasts had been cut off and placed on the bedside table. The skin and flesh had been stripped from the thighs, exposing the bone beneath. The abdomen had been opened so extensively that the internal cavity was visible, empty of most of its contents, a hollow space where organs had been. Blood covered everything. The bed, the floor, the walls near the bed. The smell would have been overwhelming, that particular scent of slaughtered meat and opened bowels and blood beginning to cool and thicken. and yet despite the extent of the violence, despite the hours it must have taken to inflict these wounds, no one in Miller's Court had heard anything unusual. The walls were thin enough that singing could be heard from room to room, but no one reported hearing screams or sounds of struggle, or the wet sounds of cutting. This silence suggested several possibilities. Perhaps Mary had been rendered unconscious before the killing began, struck or strangled into insensibility. Perhaps she'd been too drunk to fully wake when the attack started. Perhaps the throat cutting had been so swift and efficient that she had no opportunity to cry out. Or perhaps the residents of Miller's Court, exhausted by poverty and dulled by their own survival struggles, had simply slept through sounds that might otherwise have woken them. One witness, Elizabeth Prater, who lived in the room directly above number 13, would later testify that she had heard a cry sometime around 4 in the morning. She described it as a faint cry, possibly the word murder, but she had been half asleep and had not thought much of it. People shouted in the night frequently in Dorset Street. Domestic arguments, drunken fights, the general chaos of poverty. These produced cries and shouts regularly enough that they no longer prompted investigation. Elizabeth had turned over in her bed and gone back to sleep, and whatever had happened below her continued without witness. Another resident, Sarah Lewis, had entered Miller's Court around 2:30 in the morning. She'd been visiting a friend in the court and had noticed a man standing near the entrance to the passage, looking up toward the court as if waiting for someone. She described him as not very tall, wearing a black hat. Whether this man had any connection to the murder, whether he was the killer waiting to enter, or simply another resident or visitor, could not be determined. The description was too vague to be useful. Hundreds of men in Whitechapel wore black hats and stood in passages at night. The killer, having completed his work, had cleaned himself to some degree before leaving. There was water in the room, a basin or kettle, and evidence suggested he had washed his hands, perhaps his face. He may have removed blood-soaked clothing, or at least wiped away the worst of the evidence. Or he may have simply left in darkness deep enough that blood would not be immediately visible on dark clothing. The room itself suggested a certain deliberation in his actions. The fire in the grate had been built up with unusual fuel. Pieces of clothing had been burned, possibly Mary's clothing, or possibly clothing the killer had removed and wanted to destroy. The intense heat had melted the spout off the kettle that sat near the fire. This suggested the killer had stayed in the room long enough to burn evidence, long enough to warm himself, long enough to conduct his business with a leisure that the previous murders, committed in public or semi-public spaces, had not allowed. When he left, he apparently took Mary's key with him, or perhaps he locked the door from the inside and exited through the broken window, though this seemed unlikely given the window's size and position. More probably he simply pulled the door shut behind him, knowing that it would appear locked from the outside even though the lock mechanism was broken. The door would stay closed unless someone pushed hard against it or tried to open it from inside. And so he left number 13 Miller's Court appearing secure, appearing undisturbed, while inside lay evidence of violence so extreme that it would shock even those who had seen the previous Ripper murders. The hours between the murder and its discovery were hours of ordinary life continuing in parallel to extraordinary horror. Mary's neighbours slept. They woke. They went about their morning routines. They walked past her door without knowing what lay beyond it. The sun rose over London at around 7 o'clock, thin November light that did little to warm the air. The city began its daily operations. The Lord Mayor's show preparations continued. Workers made their way to factories and docks. Shopkeepers opened their establishments. And in Miller's Court, the door to number 13 remained closed, the horror inside unwitnessed. John McCarthy, the landlord, knew that Mary owed rent. He had been patient, perhaps too patient, and now the debt had accumulated to an amount that demanded action. He sent his employee, Thomas Bowyer, to collect what was owed, or at least to remind Mary that the debt existed and needed to be addressed. This was a routine task performed regularly in the lodging houses and courts of Spitalfields. Bowyer had done it many times before. He had no reason to expect this Friday morning would be different from any other. The time was approaching 11 o'clock. The Lord Mayor's procession was underway in the City of London, moving through streets lined with spectators. The newspapers would later note the strange coincidence that while London's elite celebrated civic pride and imperial power, 3 miles east in Whitechapel, the most brutal murder in the Ripper series was being discovered. But coincidence was not causation. The Lord Mayor's show had no connection to the murder except in the terrible irony of timing, the juxtaposition of celebration and horror occurring simultaneously in the same city. Thomas Bowyer approached number 13 Miller's Court. He knocked on the door. There was no answer. He knocked again, harder this time, calling Mary's name. Still no response. The door was shut tight, and the lock appeared to be engaged from inside. But Bowyer knew that the window beside the door had a broken pane stuffed with rags. He went to the window, pulled aside the rags, and looked through the broken glass into the dim interior of the room. What he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. The bed was directly in his line of sight, only a few feet from the window. And on that bed lay something that his mind initially could not process as human. Blood everywhere, flesh arranged in patterns that made no sense. And gradually, as his eyes adjusted and his brain tried to make meaning from the horror, he understood that he was looking at the remains of Mary Kelly, mutilated beyond anything he had imagined possible. Bowyer recoiled from the window. He ran from the court back to McCarthy's shop on Dorset Street, his face white, his words tumbling out incoherently. McCarthy listened, understood enough, and together they returned to Miller's Court. McCarthy looked through the window himself, confirming what Bowyer had seen, and then he made the decision that would bring the full machinery of law and investigation to this small room in this forgotten corner of London. He sent Bowyer to fetch the police. The discovery had been made. The final victim of Jack the Ripper had been found, and the news would spread through Whitechapel, and then through London, and then through the Empire with the speed of horror, transforming Mary Jane Kelly from an impoverished prostitute whom few had known or cared about into the most famous victim of the century's most famous murderer. Her death would be studied, analysed, theorised about for generations. Her name would be remembered long after the names of prime ministers and generals had faded, and the room where she died would become, for a brief moment in history, the most examined square footage in the entire British Empire. Chapter 7. The Broken Lock. Thomas Bowyer ran through the passages of Spitalfields with the image of what he'd seen burning behind his eyes. He moved through Dorset Street toward Commercial Street, where the Metropolitan Police Station stood, where constables could be found at any hour, where authority resided in the form of uniforms and badges and the power to respond to horror. His breath came hard. His mind struggled to form words that could describe what lay inside number 13 Miller's Court. The vocabulary of ordinary life did not contain adequate terms for what he had witnessed through that broken window. He found a constable on Commercial Street. The officer's name was Walter Dew, though he was not the first to reach the scene. Bowyer's words came out disordered, fragments of description. Blood, a body, Miller's Court, something terrible. The constable understood enough. He accompanied Bowyer back toward Dorset Street, and as they walked, other officers joined them. Word spread quickly through the station. Another murder, another woman. And from the description that Bowyer provided, this one was different from the others, worse than the others, though worse seemed impossible given what had already been done to Polly Nichols and Annie Chapman and the others. By the time the police reached Miller's Court, a small crowd had begun to gather. John McCarthy was there, standing near the entrance to the passage, keeping people away from number 13. News travelled through Whitechapel with remarkable speed. Neighbours had seen Bowyer running, had seen the police arriving, had understood that something significant had occurred. They congregated in Dorset Street and at the entrance to the court, their faces reflecting curiosity and dread in equal measure. They knew about the previous murders. They knew that another body found in Spitalfields likely meant another Ripper victim, and they waited to have their fears confirmed. The police approached number 13. The door was closed, and initial attempts to open it suggested it was locked from inside. But the broken window provided access, and the first officers who looked through it confirmed what Bowyer had seen. The reaction among the constables was immediate. Faces turned away, expressions of shock even among men who had seen death in its various forms. This was beyond ordinary murder. This was something that required additional authority, specialised knowledge, the presence of senior officers who could manage both the investigation and the public response that would inevitably follow. Inspector Walter Beck arrived shortly after the initial discovery. He was an experienced officer, but nothing in his experience had prepared him adequately for what lay inside the room. He looked through the window, made his own assessment, and immediately sent word to Scotland Yard and to the divisional surgeon. This was not a scene that could be handled by local constables. This required detectives, medical examiners, photographers, all the apparatus of criminal investigation that the Metropolitan Police could deploy. The decision was made not to force entry immediately. The door appeared to be locked, and breaking it down might disturb evidence. The police did not have a key. Mary had kept her key with her, and whether the killer had taken it, or whether it was somewhere in the room, could not be determined without entry. And so, the police waited. They secured the area. They kept the growing crowd at a distance. They positioned officers at the entrance to Miller's Court to prevent anyone from entering. And they waited for authorization to break the door down, for the arrival of senior officers who could take command of the scene. Inspector Frederick Aberline arrived around 11:30. He had been overseeing the Ripper investigation since the beginning, coordinating between divisions, managing the flow of information, interviewing witnesses and suspects. He was tired. The investigation had consumed months of his life with minimal results. No arrests had led to charges. No suspects had proven credible. The case had become a weight he carried constantly, a responsibility that offered no satisfaction and considerable criticism. And now another victim, and from the descriptions he was receiving, this one would exceed all the others in the attention it would demand. Aberline looked through the window. His face remained professionally composed, but those who knew him could see the effect of what he witnessed. He gave orders for the door to be forced open, but carefully, preserving as much evidence as possible. The police tested the lock mechanism and discovered that it was broken, that the door appeared locked but was actually just pulled tight shut. With some effort, they managed to open it without breaking the frame. The smell hit them immediately as the door swung open. Blood and excrement and the beginning of decomposition. Death had its own scent, unmistakable and overwhelming. The officers entered cautiously, trying not to disturb the scene more than necessary. The room was small, and the bed dominated it, and on that bed lay what remained of Mary Jane Kelly. The constables who entered first would carry the memory of that sight for the rest of their lives. Some would speak of it years later, in retirement, the image still vivid despite decades passing. Others would refuse to discuss it at all, would turn away questions, would let the official report stand as the only documentation, because what they saw exceeded the boundaries of what language could adequately describe. The human body reduced to parts, the deliberate destruction of identity, the evidence of time spent in methodical mutilation. This was not the work of someone killing in haste or panic. This was the work of someone who had privacy and darkness and time, and who had used all three to conduct violence that seemed designed not just to kill, but to obliterate. Dr. George Bagster Phillips arrived shortly after noon. He was the divisional surgeon who had examined several of the previous Ripper victims. He was a medical professional, accustomed to death and injury, experienced in post-mortem examinations. But even he required a moment to compose himself before entering the room fully and beginning his preliminary examination. The body was cold, had been dead for several hours at minimum. The extent of the mutilations made determining exact time of death difficult, but based on temperature and rigor mortis and the condition of the blood, he estimated death had occurred between 2 and 8 in the morning, most likely between 2 and 4. The photographer arrived to document the scene. Photography was still relatively new in criminal investigations, but its utility was recognised. The camera was set up outside the room, pointing through the doorway, capturing images that would become some of the most infamous photographs in criminal history. The photographs showed the bed, the body arranged upon it, the blood-soaked mattress, the walls spattered with evidence of violence. These images would be filed in police records, would be examined by investigators and medical professionals, and would eventually be sealed away, too graphic to be shown publicly, but too important to be destroyed. The police conducted a thorough search of the room. They inventoried what they found: the furniture, the few items of clothing, the ashes in the fireplace that contained remnants of burned fabric, and what appeared to be pieces of a woman's bonnet or hat. The fire had been built high, hot enough to melt the kettle spout, suggesting the killer had burned evidence. The bed frame showed no signs of restraint, no indication that Mary had been tied or held down. The violence had been conducted on someone who was already dead or unconscious, unable to resist or struggle. The missing organs were noted. The heart had been taken, though it was found later beneath the pillow. The uterus was missing entirely. Parts of the liver and kidneys had been removed. Whether these organs were taken for anatomical curiosity, for some ritual purpose, or simply as trophies, no one could say with certainty. The previous Ripper murders had also involved the removal of organs, suggesting this was part of the killer's pattern, part of whatever compulsion drove him. Outside in Dorset Street, the crowd had grown to hundreds. Word had spread throughout Whitechapel and beyond. Newspaper reporters arrived, questioning anyone who would speak to them. The police tried to maintain order, to preserve the dignity of the scene, but dignity was difficult to maintain in the face of such intense public interest. People climbed on carts and barrels to see over the heads of the crowd. They pressed against the police cordon. They asked questions, demanded information, created a carnival atmosphere that seemed obscene given what had occurred, but which was also understandable given human nature and the magnetic pull of tragedy. The body was eventually removed, placed on a stretcher, and covered, carried through the court, and loaded into an ambulance wagon. The crowd watched in silence as the stretcher passed. Some women wept. Some men removed their hats. The gesture of respect was brief before the crowd's energy returned, before the questions and speculation resumed. The police cleared the scene, locked the room, posted a guard. The investigation would continue, but the immediate work of documentation and evidence collection was complete. Mary Jane Kelly had been found. The last victim of Jack the Ripper had been discovered in circumstances that exceeded all previous murders in their horror. And now the city would react. The newspapers would print their sensational headlines. The police would face renewed pressure. The theories would multiply, and Mary herself would transition from person to symbol, from individual to icon, her death becoming the defining image of the Whitechapel murders, her name becoming inseparable from the legend of Jack the Ripper. The broken lock that had granted her killer privacy had also granted him the opportunity to create the murder that would be remembered above all others, the killing that would obsess criminologists and historians for generations, the final and most terrible act of a murderer who would never be caught. Chapter 8. The Room. The physicians who examined Mary Jane Kelly's body did so first at the scene, then later at the Shoreditch mortuary where she was taken for a complete post-mortem examination. Dr. George Bagster Phillips conducted the official autopsy, assisted by Dr. Thomas Bond, who had been brought in specifically to review all the Ripper murders and provide a comprehensive medical opinion. Both men were experienced in forensic medicine, accustomed to examining bodies that had died violently. But the examination of Mary Kelly tested even their professional detachment. The body arrived at the mortuary in the early afternoon of November 9th. It had been transported carefully, though the extent of the mutilations meant that preservation of the body's position was largely irrelevant. What had been done could not be undone through careful handling. The physicians prepared their instruments and their notes, and they began the systematic documentation that would form the official medical record of the murder. The throat wound was examined first. The cut extended from ear to ear, 6 to 7 inches in length, cutting through all the soft tissues down to the spinal column. The windpipe had been severed completely. The major blood vessels, the carotid arteries and jugular veins, had been cut through. This wound alone would have caused death within moments, unconsciousness within seconds. The force required to create such a wound was substantial, suggesting either a very sharp blade or considerable strength behind the cutting motion, or both. The face had been mutilated systematically. The nose had been cut off almost entirely, leaving only cartilage and bone. The cheeks had been sliced away. The flesh removed in pieces that had been placed elsewhere in the room. The ears had been partially cut, though not fully removed. The forehead had been flayed, the skin and flesh peeled back to expose the frontal bone of the skull. The eyelids had been cut. The lips had been sliced. The overall effect was not random violence, but methodical destruction, as if the killer had wanted to erase every feature that made Mary recognizable as the person she had been. The breasts had been removed. The cuts were relatively clean, suggesting a blade that was sharp and a hand that was steady. The breasts had been placed on the table beside the bed, arranged deliberately rather than discarded randomly. This placement suggested the killer had taken time to position things according to some logic known only to himself. The abdomen had been opened with a long vertical incision from the sternum to the pubic bone. The cut was deep, penetrating through skin and muscle and fat to expose the abdominal cavity completely. The intestines had been removed and placed to the right side of the body, draped over the shoulder and arm. Parts of the intestines had been cut away and were missing. The stomach had been cut open, the liver had been cut, and portions of it were missing. The kidneys had been removed, though one kidney remained in place while the other was missing entirely. The uterus was absent. This was consistent with the previous Ripper murders, particularly Annie Chapman and Catherine Eddowes, from whom the uterus had also been taken. Whether this removal indicated anatomical knowledge, or simply a killer who had learned through practice which organs could be removed relatively easily, was debated among the examining physicians. Dr. Bond argued that the wounds showed no particular surgical skill, that anyone could remove organs if they were willing to cut and pull without concern for the victim's survival. Dr. Phillips was less certain, suggesting that some of the cuts showed precision that might indicate medical or anatomical training. The heart was missing from the chest cavity. Initially, this caused confusion, as the previous Ripper murders had not involved removal of the heart. But during the examination of the room, the heart had been found on the bed, beneath the pillow near where Mary's head had rested. Why the killer had removed the heart and then placed it there, rather than taking it away as he had taken other organs, remained unclear. Perhaps he had been interrupted. Perhaps the heart had special significance that required different handling. Or perhaps there was no logic to it beyond the random decisions of a mind operating without normal constraints. The lower body had been mutilated extensively. The flesh had been stripped from the thighs, cut away in sections to expose the bones beneath. The vaginal area had been cut and mutilated. The buttocks had been cut away. These wounds suggested a level of frenzy or sustained attack that exceeded even the facial mutilations. The killer had spent considerable time on this destruction, suggesting either that the lower body held particular significance for him, or that he had simply continued cutting until exhaustion or some other factor caused him to stop. The total amount of blood in the room was estimated at several pints, most of what the human body contained. The blood had soaked the mattress, spread across the floor beside the bed, spattered on the walls within reach of the bed. The pattern suggested that much of the blood had been released when the throat was cut, that Mary had been on or near the bed when that initial wound was inflicted, and that she had not moved afterward. The subsequent mutilations had been performed on a body that was already dead or dying, already unable to resist or respond. The examination of the body took several hours. The physicians measured wounds, documented their observations, collected what physical evidence they could. They noted that there were no defensive wounds on the hands or arms, no evidence that Mary had fought her attacker. This suggested either that the attack had been so swift she had no opportunity to defend herself, or that she had been unconscious or restrained in some way before the cutting began, or that she had trusted the person who killed her enough that she did not perceive the danger until it was too late. The estimated time of death was placed between 2 and 4 in the morning, based on body temperature, rigor mortis, and the condition of the blood. This timeline was consistent with the testimony of neighbours who had heard a cry around 4 in the morning, though whether that cry had come from Mary or from someone else in the court could not be determined with certainty. If Mary had died at 4, then the killer had spent anywhere from 1 to 3 hours with her body, conducting his mutilations in the privacy and darkness of the locked room. The weapon used was estimated to be a knife with a blade 6 to 8 inches long, sharp on one edge, pointed at the tip. This was consistent with the weapons hypothesized in the previous Ripper murders, a knife similar to what a butcher or surgeon might use, though neither profession could be definitively linked to the killings. The blade would need to be sturdy enough to cut through muscle and cartilage without breaking, and sharp enough to make the relatively clean cuts that had been observed. Beyond these basic parameters, the weapon's specific characteristics could not be determined. Thousands of such knives existed in London, used for legitimate purposes by tradesmen and professionals throughout the city. Dr. Thomas Bond, after examining Mary Kelly's body and reviewing the files on the previous Ripper victims, wrote a report that attempted to characterize the killer. He suggested that the murderer was a man of physical strength and great coolness and daring. He noted that the killer had no scientific or anatomical knowledge, that the wounds showed no surgical skill despite their extent. He theorized that the killer was subject to periodic attacks of homicidal and erotic mania, that these attacks were possibly connected to lunar cycles or other periodic triggers. He suggested the killer was likely solitary and eccentric in his habits, possibly living alone, able to come and go without attracting attention. These conclusions were speculative, based on inference rather than evidence, but they represented an early attempt at what would later be called criminal profiling, using the characteristics of the crimes to deduce characteristics of the criminal. Whether Dr. Bond's profile was accurate could not be tested, because the Whitechapel murderer was never caught. His identity remained unknown, and thus his characteristics remained unknown. The profile could neither be confirmed nor disproven. The inquest into Mary Kelly's death would be held in the days following the discovery. A jury would view the body, would hear testimony from witnesses and police officers and medical examiners, would deliberate on the cause of death and the circumstances surrounding it. But the outcome was never in doubt. Mary Jane Kelly had been murdered. She had been murdered by a person or persons unknown. And that person had mutilated her body in ways that exceeded normal human violence, that suggested either madness or a particular form of hatred or compulsion that defied easy explanation. The room at number 13 Miller's Court was sealed after the police completed their examination. The landlord, John McCarthy, would eventually have it cleaned, the blood scrubbed from the floor and walls, the mattress burned, the room prepared for another tenant. Life in Whitechapel did not pause for tragedy. The rent still needed to be collected. The room still represented income, and there were always people desperate enough for shelter that even a room where murder had occurred would find an occupant. But for the moment, in the days immediately following the discovery, the room remained as it had been found, a chamber of horror preserved temporarily as evidence, as documentation, as the final testament to what the Whitechapel murderer had been capable of when granted privacy and time. The room itself was ordinary, 12 feet by 10, a space no different from thousands of other rooms in Spitalfields. But what had happened there transformed it into something extraordinary, something that would be remembered and studied and theorized about for more than a century afterward. The room became inseparable from the murder, and the murder became inseparable from the mythology of Jack the Ripper. and thus number 13 Miller's Court entered history not as a place where a woman had lived, but as the place where she had died, where the most infamous murder of the Victorian era had been committed, where the broken lock had granted a killer the opportunity to demonstrate the full extent of his capacity for violence. Chapter 9. The Last Inquest. The inquest into the death of Mary Jane Kelly opened on Monday, November the 12th, 3 days after the discovery of her body. The proceedings were held at Shoreditch Town Hall, a short distance from Miller's Court. The coroner was Roderick MacDonald, a relatively inexperienced official who had recently been appointed to his position. This inexperience would show in his handling of the inquest, which was briefer and less thorough than the inquest into the previous Ripper victims had been. Some would later argue that this brevity was intentional, that there were pressures to conclude the matter quickly and avoid the extensive public attention that previous inquests had generated. But whether by design or simply by incompetence, the Kelly inquest would prove unsatisfying to those seeking answers. The jury was assembled from local residents, working men who were required by law to serve when called. They were taken to the mortuary where Mary Kelly's body lay, so that they might view the remains and understand the nature of the crime they were investigating. This viewing was standard procedure in inquests, intended to ensure the jury understood the severity of what had occurred. But the viewing of Mary Kelly's body tested even this standard practice. Several jurors turned away. Some appeared physically ill. The body had been arranged as respectfully as possible, covered except for the face and neck where identification could be attempted. But even this partial viewing was sufficient to communicate the horror of what had been done. The first witness called was Joseph Barnett, Mary's former partner. He appeared nervous, grief-stricken, uncomfortable in the formal setting of the inquest. He testified about his relationship with Mary, about how they had lived together for more than a year, about how he had moved out at the end of October but had continued to see her and give her money when he could. He was asked to identify the body, and he did so based on the ears and eyes, as the face was too damaged for certain identification. He told the court what he knew of Mary's history, that she had said she was born in Limerick, that she'd been married once to a man named Davies, that she had lived in Cardiff and London. He spoke of her habits, her drinking, her tendency to sing. His testimony was emotional but coherent, and when he finished, he was dismissed. Thomas Bowyer testified next, describing how he had been sent to collect rent from Mary Kelly, how he had knocked and received no answer, how he had looked through the broken window and seen what lay inside. His testimony was brief, focused on the facts of discovery rather than his emotional response. The coroner did not press him for details beyond the basic sequence of events. John McCarthy, the landlord, confirmed Bowyer's account and provided details about the rent Mary owed and the condition of the room when he had last seen it in the weeks before her death. He noted that the lock on the door had been broken for some time, that it could be made to appear locked from the outside even though the mechanism no longer functioned properly. This explained how the killer had been able to leave the room secured without needing Mary's key. Inspector Frederick Abberlin testified about the police investigation. He described the scene as it had been found, though he spared the jury the most graphic details. He outlined the steps the police had taken, securing the area, documenting evidence, interviewing witnesses. He acknowledged that despite extensive investigation, no suspect had been identified. The Ripper investigation had consumed enormous resources, had generated thousands of pages of reports and statements, but had produced no arrest that led to charges. The killer remained unknown. Dr. George Bagster Phillips gave medical testimony. He described the wounds in clinical language, documenting what had been done to Mary Kelly's body without editorializing about the horror of it. He provided his estimate of time of death, his assessment of the weapon used, his professional opinion about whether the killer possessed medical or anatomical knowledge. He concluded, as Dr. Bond had, that the mutilation showed violence rather than skill, frenzy rather than surgical precision, though he acknowledged this was interpretation rather than fact. Several neighbours from Miller's Court testified about what they had or had not heard on the night of the murder. Elizabeth Prater spoke of hearing a cry of "murder" around 4 in the morning, but thinking nothing of it. Sarah Lewis described seeing a man standing near the entrance to the court around 2:30. Though her description was too vague to be useful for identification, other witnesses provided fragmentary accounts of seeing Mary Kelly earlier in the evening, of seeing her with a man, though the descriptions of this man varied so widely that they could not be assembled into a coherent picture. The inquest proceeded quickly, much more quickly than the inquests into the previous Ripper victims. The coroner seemed eager to conclude the proceedings, to arrive at a verdict without extensive examination of every detail. Some of the jurors appeared uncomfortable with this speed, asking questions that the coroner deflected or answered briefly. There was a sense that the inquest was being managed, that some authority beyond the coroner's office wanted the matter concluded without the prolonged public spectacle that previous inquests had become. After less than a day of testimony, the coroner instructed the jury on their deliberations. Their task was simple: to determine the cause of death, and, if possible, to identify who was responsible. The cause of death was obvious. Mary Jane Kelly had been murdered, her throat cut and her body mutilated. As for responsibility, the evidence pointed to a person or persons unknown. No suspect had been identified. No witness had seen the killer clearly enough to provide useful identification. The crime had been committed in private behind a closed door, and the killer had vanished without leaving evidence that could lead to his capture. The jury deliberated briefly and returned their verdict. Mary Jane Kelly had been willfully murdered by person or persons unknown. This was the same verdict that had been returned in the previous Ripper cases. It was unsatisfying but accurate. Someone had killed Mary Kelly, that someone remained unknown, and given the state of the investigation, that someone would likely remain unknown indefinitely. The verdict was recorded. The inquest was concluded. The legal proceedings were complete. Mary Jane Kelly could now be buried, and the investigation could continue outside the formal structure of the coroner's court. But the brevity of the inquest left many questions unanswered. Why had the coroner rushed the proceedings? Why had certain witnesses not been called? Why had the medical testimony been relatively brief compared to previous inquests? These questions would persist, feeding conspiracy theories that suggested official cover-up or deliberate misdirection. But the simpler explanation was probably accurate. The inquest had been brief because the evidence was limited, because prolonging it would serve no purpose beyond satisfying public curiosity, and because the authorities wanted to avoid the media circus that previous Ripper inquests had generated. The body of Mary Jane Kelly was released for burial following the inquest. She had no family in London to claim her, no funds to pay for a proper funeral. But the residents of Spitalfields, particularly the women who had known her, contributed what they could. A collection was taken up in the pubs and lodging houses of Dorset Street. The amount gathered was small, but sufficient to provide Mary with a coffin and a burial plot, to ensure she was not simply thrown into a pauper's grave without ceremony or marker. The funeral was held on Monday, November the 19th, exactly 10 days after her death. A crowd gathered on Dorset Street, women from the lodging houses, residents of Miller's Court, curious onlookers drawn by the notoriety of the case. The coffin was carried from the mortuary to a horse-drawn hearse, and the procession moved slowly through the streets of Whitechapel toward the Catholic cemetery in Leytonstone, about 6 miles distant. The route took them through the heart of the East End, past the sites where the other Ripper victims had been killed, past the lodging houses and pubs and courts where Mary had lived her brief life. The crowd that followed the hearse numbered in the hundreds, possibly thousands. They lined the streets, removed their hats as the coffin passed, some weeping, some simply watching in silence. The newspapers reported on the funeral extensively, describing it as a moment when the East End showed its respect for one of its own, when the poor and desperate of Whitechapel came together to honour a woman whose life had been hard and whose death had been terrible. Whether this interpretation was accurate or whether the crowd was simply drawn by morbid curiosity was impossible to determine. Perhaps both motives existed simultaneously. Respect and fascination intertwined in the Victorian relationship with death and tragedy. The burial service was brief. A priest spoke words over the coffin, prayers for the dead, acknowledgement of suffering and hope for peace beyond this life. The coffin was lowered into the ground and the earth was filled in over it. A simple wooden cross marked the grave temporarily, though whether any permanent marker was ever installed remained unclear. The cemetery records documented her burial, but the exact location of the grave would be forgotten over time, lost among thousands of other burials in that sprawling Catholic cemetery in East London. Mary Jane Kelly, born in Ireland or Wales or perhaps somewhere else entirely, dead at 25 in a rented room in Whitechapel, was now buried in ground that would remember her only as one more casualty of poverty and violence. But history would not forget her. Her death had been too public, too spectacular, too thoroughly documented to fade into obscurity. She would become the most famous of the Ripper victims, the one whose murder was studied most extensively, whose name was remembered when the names of the others began to fade. She had wanted, perhaps, to be more than she was, to escape the poverty of Miller's Court, to find something better than the life of the streets. And in dying, in becoming the Ripper's final victim, she had achieved a kind of immortality, though not the kind anyone would choose. The inquest was over, the funeral was complete, the investigation would continue, though with diminishing intensity as weeks and months passed without new leads. And gradually, as November turned to December and winter settled over London, the focus of public attention would shift away from the Ripper murders, away from Mary Kelly and the horror of number 13 Miller's Court, toward other concerns and tragedies. But for those who had known her, for those who had walked the streets of Spitalfields with her, the memory would persist, of a woman who had sung through the walls of Miller's Court, whose voice had carried hope or sadness or simply the need to fill silence with sound, whose life had been reduced to survival, and whose death had been transformed into legend. Chapter 10. The Silence. After the murder of Mary Jane Kelly marked the end of the canonical Ripper series. After November 9th, 1888, there were no more killings that bore the distinctive characteristics of the previous 5 murders: the throat cutting, the abdominal mutilations, the removal of organs, the targeting of prostitutes in Whitechapel. The killer, whoever he had been, vanished as completely as if he had never existed. The sudden cessation of the murders was as mysterious as the murders themselves had been, and it generated theories that would multiply over the decades and eventually the centuries that followed. The immediate response to the Kelly murder was an intensification of police activity. The Metropolitan Police flooded Whitechapel with constables. Every suspicious person was questioned. Every lead, no matter how tenuous, was investigated. The pressure on the police to solve the case was enormous, from the public, from the press, from politicians who faced questions in Parliament about why the most advanced police force in the world could not catch a single murderer. The Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, Sir Charles Warren, resigned in early November, though his resignation was related to broader disputes with the Home Office rather than the Ripper case specifically. But the timing suggested that the failure to catch the Ripper had contributed to his departure. Spectre Aberlin and his team continued their investigation through the winter of 1888 and into 1889. They interviewed hundreds of people. They followed leads that came from across Britain and from abroad, letters claiming to be from the Ripper, tips from people who believed they knew the killer's identity, confessions from individuals who were clearly not involved, but who sought attention or notoriety. The investigation generated an enormous archive of documents, witness statements, police reports, memoranda between departments, correspondence with officials. But all this documentation led nowhere. No suspect emerged who could be definitively linked to the murders. no evidence was found that pointed conclusively to any individual. The theories about the killer's identity began almost immediately and never stopped. He was a doctor, some said, because the removal of organs suggested medical knowledge. He was a butcher, others argued, because the cutting showed familiarity with slaughtering techniques. He was a midwife, a few suggested, because midwives had access to medical instruments and knowledge of female anatomy. He was a foreign sailor, according to another theory, someone who arrived in London's docks and left again after the murders, which would explain why the killing stopped. He was a Jewish slaughterman, the most pernicious theory, one that fed anti-Semitic prejudices that were already strong in Victorian England. Some theories were more elaborate, suggesting royal conspiracies or Masonic rituals or government cover-ups. These theories argued that the Ripper was someone of high social standing, whose identity was known to authorities but protected for political reasons. The theories pointed to the brevity of the Kelly inquest as evidence of official suppression, to the resignation of Commissioner Warren as indication of scandal, to various coincidences and circumstances as proof of conspiracy. These theories were almost certainly false, products of the Victorian love of sensation, and the human tendency to find patterns even when none existed. But they persisted, fed by the frustration of an unsolved case and the appeal of believing that mysteries always had hidden explanations. As winter turned to spring and then summer without any new murders, some began to argue that the Ripper had died. Perhaps he had committed suicide, consumed by guilt or madness. Perhaps he had died of natural causes. Disease was common enough in Victorian London that anyone might die suddenly. Perhaps he had been arrested for some other crime and was now in prison, unable to continue his murders. These theories could not be proven, but they offered a kind of closure, a way to explain the cessation of the killings without needing to accept that the murderer had simply stopped. Others argued that the Ripper had left England. The theory of the foreign sailor supported this, someone who had been in London temporarily and had then departed, either returning to his home country or moving to another port. Some claimed there were similar murders in other cities, in the United States, in Australia, in other parts of Europe, and suggested these might be the work of the same killer. But when these cases were examined closely, the similarities usually proved superficial. The Ripper's signature was distinctive enough that murders by other perpetrators were not easily confused with his work. A third possibility, less discussed but perhaps most likely, was that the Ripper had simply stopped. Serial murderers, as they would later be called, sometimes did cease their activities without dying or being caught. They married, they found other outlets for their compulsions, they were satisfied by what they had done, or their circumstances changed in ways that prevented them from continuing. If the Ripper had been someone whose opportunity to kill depended on specific conditions, living in Whitechapel, having freedom of movement at night, being in a psychological state that permitted such violence, then changes in any of these conditions might have ended the murder series. He might have moved to another part of London where opportunity was less available. He might have married or taken employment that restricted his nighttime activities. He might have been institutionalized for mental illness under a different identity. The possibilities were endless, and none could be proven. The investigation continued formally until the mid-1890s, though with decreasing intensity after 1889. New suspects were identified periodically and investigated. Some were thought credible enough that police spent considerable time tracking them, but none led to charges. The case files grew thicker, the archive more extensive, but the outcome remained unchanged. The Whitechapel murderer was not caught, his identity remained unknown. And gradually, as the years passed, the investigation moved from active to cold. From an ongoing concern to a historical curiosity, the women of Whitechapel continued their lives. The murders had terrified them, had made their already dangerous work more dangerous still. But fear competed with necessity, and necessity usually won. They walked the streets, they brought men to their rooms, they survived or they did not, and those who did not die at the hands of the Ripper died from other causes. disease, violence, poverty, the accumulated weight of lives lived at the margin. The memory of the murders remained, passed between women as a warning, as evidence of danger that always existed, but which for a brief period in the autumn of 1888 had become explicit and undeniable. Miller's Court continued to exist. The room at number 13 was cleaned and rented again. Life in Whitechapel did not pause for tragedy. The court remained a cheap housing option for those who had no better alternatives, and such people were always available in sufficient numbers. Whether the new tenants knew what had happened in their room, whether they were troubled by the history, was not recorded. The physical evidence was gone. The blood scrubbed away, the mattress burned, the walls cleaned. What remained was only memory, and memory could be ignored if necessary. Dorset Street itself would eventually be demolished, though not until decades after the murders. Urban renewal projects in the early 20th century would clear many of the worst slums of Whitechapel, replacing them with improved housing, wider streets, better sanitation. Miller's Court disappeared in these renovations, the passage filled in, the buildings torn down, the geography altered until nothing remained to mark where Mary Kelly had lived and died. The street itself survived longer, but by the mid-20th century even Dorset Street would be renamed and rebuilt, its reputation as the worst street in London finally erased through physical transformation. But the murders themselves could not be erased. The Ripper case had captured public imagination in ways that few criminal cases before or since have managed. The combination of extreme violence, mysterious circumstances, famous locale, and unsolved outcome created a story that was perfect for endless retelling and speculation. Books were written about the case, first as journalism and true crime, then as history, eventually as fiction and theory. The Ripper became a character, a symbol, a figure in cultural mythology who represented Victorian fears about urbanisation, class division, sexuality, madness, and the limits of authority. Mary Jane Kelly, along with the other victims, became famous in death in ways they had never been in life. Their names were remembered. Their photographs, taken in the mortuary, were preserved and eventually published. Their life stories, or the fragments that could be assembled, were documented and analysed. They were transformed from individuals into representations, their actual lives and deaths becoming material for others to interpret and use for various purposes: entertainment, scholarship, moral argument, artistic expression. The irony was profound. These women had lived in poverty and obscurity, had struggled to survive in circumstances that offered little hope of improvement, had died violently in a city that barely acknowledged their existence when they were alive, and then their deaths had elevated them to a kind of immortality, had made them subjects of endless fascination, had ensured that their names would be remembered for centuries. Whether this was justice or further exploitation was debatable. They had not chosen fame. They had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, had encountered someone whose violence would become historically significant. The autumn of 1888 passed into history. The Victorian era continued for another dozen years before Queen Victoria's death in 1901 would mark the transition to the Edwardian period. The 20th century would bring technologies and changes that would have been unimaginable to those who walked the streets of Whitechapel in the gas-lit darkness of the 1880s. But the Ripper case would persist, would be investigated by new generations using new methods: fingerprint analysis, DNA testing, criminal profiling, computer databases. Every technological advance would be applied to the old mystery, and every investigation would reach the same conclusion: insufficient evidence to identify the killer with certainty. More than a century would pass. Whitechapel would transform from slum to fashionable neighbourhood, gentrification erasing most traces of its Victorian poverty. The courts and passages would be gone, replaced by modern buildings and wider streets. The people who had lived there would be forgotten, except as statistics in history books. But the Ripper murders would remain, would be studied and theorized about and reimagined in countless books and films and television programs and tours that would take visitors to the sites where the murders occurred, or at least to the approximate locations, since the exact geography had been altered beyond recognition. And in all this remembering and reimagining and theorizing, the actual women, Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, Mary Jane Kelly, would sometimes disappear behind the mythology of their murderer. Their lives would be reduced to their deaths. Their individual stories would be overwhelmed by the larger narrative of the Ripper investigation. They would become victims in every sense, not only of the violence that killed them, but of the historical process that transformed them into symbols, and forgot they had once been human beings, with hopes and disappointments and ordinary lives that happened to end extraordinarily. The silence after the murders was the silence of unsolved mystery, of questions that would never be answered, of a killer who vanished into history without leaving his name. But it was also the silence of women whose voices were lost, whose stories were incomplete, whose dignity was compromised first by poverty and then by fame they did not seek. The Ripper took their lives, history took their identities, and what remained was memory of a type that preserved the horror of their deaths while forgetting much of the humanity of their lives. The candle burned low, the chamber fell silent, and history, once again, turned the page in the dark, moving forward while leaving behind questions that time could not answer and tragedies that repetition could not diminish. The autumn of blood had ended, the vigil had ceased, and London, vast and indifferent, continued its existence, absorbing the murders into its long chronicle of human suffering and survival, one more chapter in a story that had no clear beginning and would have no definitive end.